Welcome to A Healthy Dose of Humour, a podcast series that sets out to explore the intersection of humor and health. I've partnered with Leith, a creative agency with specialisms in advertising, communications, and health, to bring together patients, healthcare professionals, scientists, and advertising experts to debate and discuss all the ways that humor can help us communicate. So let's get stuck in. In today's episode, we are going to be taking a look at how we can help manage our own health with humor. Joining me is Susan Daniels, Vice President of Patient Strategy and Engagement at Lumanity, which is a medical communications agency. Susan builds and embeds a culture of patient centricity across the business. And she's also developed a suite of patient programs to support clients to engage patients and their advocates in medicine development. That's amazing. A pharmacist and passionate patient advocate, she's also on the board of Lymphoma Action in the UK, being a lymphoma survivor herself, and in all of her capacities empowers patients and families to form strong partnerships with their healthcare providers for better outcomes. It's incredible. Thank you for joining us. I'm also joined by Anthony Alderson, director of the Pleasance, where we are recording. In 2005, Anthony became the director here of the Pleasance Theatre Trust with the ambition of growing the Pleasance platform and creating more opportunities for artistic entrepreneurship and expanding the Pleasance's development and performance platform in London and Edinburgh. Since then, he's sold millions of tickets to tens of millions of visitors, accounting for 1 in every 5 tickets sold at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe for a show at the Pleasance. That's incredible. That is a lot of tickets. He's also on the board of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe Society, was former vice chair. In fact, he is proud to be a patron of Waverley Care for the last 20 years, a leading charity in Scotland caring for people with HIV and hepatitis C, where he's helped raise over £700,000 through the Pleasance Partnership. He is passionate in supporting mental health amongst young people. I'm also joined by Tatum. Now, Tatum found Shine Cancer Support after being diagnosed with breast cancer at only 35. She went out for a drink with them, and now she works for them. If only getting a job was that easy. Tatum, and is the host of their podcast, Not Your Grandma's Cancer Show. If you haven't heard of Shine, it is the only UK charity supporting adults 20 to 49 who have experienced a cancer diagnosis. And last but certainly not least is Vic Milne, who is head of strategy at Leith and is very proud to manage a team of brilliant people with capabilities ranging from traditional brand planning to digital ecosystem modeling. In her 27 years in the industry, she has worked across a multitude of campaigns that range from selling whiskey and fizzy pop to behavior change to improve health outcomes. The irony of which is not lost, I think, on any of us, especially yourself, Vic, is it? Thank you all so much for joining me. Welcome. Now, my first question in this regard is to do with the relationship between humor and acceptance. And if you accept what you're going through or not. Tatum, can I turn to you first? Would you agree that acceptance and humor are very closely related in this journey?
I hope not.
Oh,
because I don't think I've accepted anything.
Okay.
And it's been a long time since I was diagnosed. I actually threw a party the night I was diagnosed to get my friends over to have a drink and a laugh when there was no acceptance yet.
Okay.
Not even, a sign on the horizon of acceptance. So yeah, I think that for me, humor comes out of camaraderie and connection, or at least an attempt at it. So I think there was a sense of like getting people together and kind of feeling like I was in it with my friends. And that's where the humor that night came from.
So it sounds like there was humor before there was acceptance.
Oh, yes.
From the moment that you were given the news, you turned to humor as a form of comfort.
Yeah. No one expected me to throw a party that night, but I was like, bring drinks. I've got no time to organize anything, but just come over. Yeah.
And did you announce your diagnosis at the party?
Yes. Well, beforehand, I was like, I've been diagnosed, come over, we're having a party. Yes.
And was there a lot of laughter at the party?
There was, absolutely.
So in itself, so you turned to humor, actually, the moment that you heard the diagnosis, even though you even feel right now you haven't totally accepted it.
Well, I mean, I think acceptance is such a heavy word, and I don't think you necessarily always want to accept something that is horrible, ever. So, I mean, I think that humor can definitely come in before. I mean, maybe there are more evolved people than me that have deeply accepted things, but I don't think I'm one of them.
You sound evolved enough to have turned to humor as a form of solace. So I think that definitely says something. Susan, what, in your experience working with a wide range of patients, where have you found humor comes in the journey?
I think that particularly if you're looking at chronic diseases, it's about kind of understanding what you need at different points of your journey. So in some cases, levity and humor is a really great, opportunity to deal with some of the emotions. But in other cases, it may not be, as appropriate. And it's really about understanding, in your own mind and body, the way that humor helps you, I think, to deal with what you're going through at any point in time. And it's so hard to say that any one person is going to react the same way, but it's really important to recognize that you need to respond differently as a patient and as well as healthcare professionals to what people are going through.
I love what you just said then, because I think that is so important. And I think the humor needs to be almost self-directed. Mm-hmm. Because at another point in time, if someone said, throw a party, it would be oppressive. It would be like, what do you mean I should throw a party? It has to come from you. Like, I know some people that have named their tumor, and they've put Facebook updates or Instagram updates Harvey's going down with this chemo, Whereas if someone came over to me and said, well, how's Bob the breast cancer tumor? No, that would be awful. So I think it has to be self-generated, and it has to come from that point that you're feeling it and that you have some control over the humor as well.
I was going to ask, actually, and I think you made the point there, and it's kind of half answered my question, was you chose the party. You chose to deal with it with humour. How did your friends react? When did they feel comfortable enough to have a laugh with you that night? Was it instantly, or did they have to check in that you were okay first?
Yeah, so I think that they were a bit in shock that evening. But I think actually us all getting together, and that's where I think the camaraderie part of it is that actually when one person hears the laughter and it's kind of like, okay, we're getting a handle on this, and I think they could see how I was that evening. It was actually really reassuring. And then, yes, I could get funny messages. And, one of my friends was like, I'm not good with the heavy stuff, but if you want to go out and need the distraction, call me, I'm your girl, And actually, I think there's something about that level of communication. I know on TikTok, there's a video, do you want to be helped, heard, or hugged? The 3 H's. And I think we should add humor in there, and be able to check in. So, because it's really hard for friends to know what to say or what to do.
Do you think, just because we're talking about acceptance and because you chose to throw a party, do you think at any point your friends thought you were potentially in denial because of the way that you reacted?
I don't think so. But I mean, I don't think at the beginning you can possibly know how you're going to feel going through. So I think you're in a bubble. I don't know if it's denial, but there is a bit of a bubble around the experience because, if I was to be back there, I might do something very different this time. But yeah, so I think a bit of denial is really normal at that point.
Or at least it takes a while for it to sink in, doesn't it? Because It's not, you went from, the day before, because it wasn't the day before your birthday?
It was really close to my birthday.
It was really close to your birthday. So you'd just gone through birthday.
So I was like, oh my God, I'm so old. I'm so old. Like everyone else's lives are going really well. And then I was diagnosed and I was like, I'm so young. So it was like that kind of flip of a switch of how everything changes, like how you view everything.
I wanted to ask whether it helped. I mean, it presumably helped throwing a party. It helped your friends as much as it helped you.
Yeah. I mean, it was a bit of a community feel going into it. And it didn't necessarily always feel that way for me, because I think at some point as with a lot of people, especially young people with cancer, I did start to feel isolated because your experience ends up being so different from your friends, and your life trajectory ends up being so different, that I was so grateful that at that point, there was, for me, a sense of community that was created that night. And I still, kind of think back fondly, if looking at myself a bit naively, about it. And, I'm still grateful that they were there for me. But there were times of terrible loneliness that came afterwards.
For me, my own diagnosis, I think you send signals quite clearly to the people around you, your friends, your family, and it all has to deal with how you accept or don't accept it. So, particularly with cancer, there's a lot of negative words around it. People are battling or fighters, or it's seen to be a very kind of negative experience. But, in my case, I was like, okay, this is what it is. This is what I have. I know what I have to do. I'm going to get through it, and you're all going to help me. And I think because I tried to be very positive, live my life, as normal as I could, that probably gave people more comfort to be a little bit less serious, with me, because my attitude was different. And so I welcomed, a bit of positivity, which, I think we all in these situations want to feel a bit human and be able to still enjoy a laugh or a good time. But there are others that, go inward and perhaps aren't as open to that sort of experience.
I've heard that that naming your cancer is quite a common thing. A friend recently who's just become healthier from cancer, but he called his prostate cancer Paul. And it was like having a family member at the table. They would talk about Paul quite openly as if it was a sort of, well, we now live with Paul, so we might as well, invite him into the family and talk about it. But it was obviously an icebreaker for the family.
Paul. There will never be another Paul in that family, though.
I suspect
there will be
not,
no grandchildren
no.
called Paul. No.
And just kind of going to that positivity, I think that, when someone's feeling it, that's lovely. And it's absolutely to be celebrated. I think where it gets tricky is when other people are sort of putting positivity on you. And that's again when there's that switch of, if it's self-directed humor, or, how you're feeling is feeling pretty good, or if it's coming from the outside and it can kind of squish you and make you feel like you can't actually talk about what you're really going through or how you really feel. It's when you can start to feel isolated and alienated. You can be surrounded by people, but actually not feel like there's space to be understood. So it's a really tricky one, because again, kind of going back, it's hard to know from friends, like, oh, which way are we going today?
I wonder if you feel sort of smothered by positivity and sometimes cry out for a bit of humour in situations, you know what I mean? So everybody's obviously been positive and like, oh, I'm so sorry and I'm here for you, and lots of positive things where you're just like, someone make a joke, it's too intense. Does that happen ever in your experience?
I can share an experience. So when I was having my chemotherapy, my immune system was very suppressed, and they always warn you about the chance of developing an infection or sepsis. So after I'd had a treatment, all of a sudden my temperature went through the roof, and I knew straight away, okay, this isn't good. So my family wasn't with me, so I actually called a girlfriend, and she took me to the emergency room. And straight away they said, even though I felt okay, they looked at my numbers and said, oh yes, we need to treat this. So took me back into the resuscitation room, which is never a nice experience, but we had the most lovely, charming, handsome young doctor, and we had such a giggle with him, my girlfriend and I, and it was quite a serious situation, and I could feel just by the language and what they were doing around me that actually I was probably in a bit of trouble. And I asked him, I said, so am I going to die? And he just looked at me and he said, oh no, don't worry about anything. He said, I've got it all under control. You're good until midnight. And I thought, okay, and what happens at midnight? And he said, well, I leave and then you're someone else's problem. And so even though it was quite serious, he was just so lovely in his approach. And I felt very comfortable with him and it was very reassuring. So for the rest of the evening, even though we're in resus in a hospital and I'm hooked up to all these different medications and machines, my girlfriend and I the whole time were like, okay, how do we get him back? How do we get him back? Can you please fake being unwell again? And it was just a lovely experience because of his approach and his humor, even though it was a very unhumorous situation. And I lasted past midnight, which is good news too.
Spoiler alert, you lasted a lot longer than that, didn't you? That's great. So what I'm hearing is that A, you don't need to accept it to be able to start using humor as a means of coping, but also that the humor really needs to be patient-led. Or patient accepted in the case, because that sounds like it was doctor-led humor, but it was very much welcomed in the moment. But when it comes to dealing with closer friends in the situation, that they do need to take their lead from you. Otherwise, it can feel like they're minimizing your situation.
Yes.
If they're not. That's tricky though. That's tricky for friends, isn't it? Because they're going to have to just really be tuned into where you're at to be able to understand how much humor to use? Or are we saying that humor is always acceptable and it's positivity? Because we did separate out positivity from humor there in that conversation. Are we saying that positivity can sometimes be a bit of a drag, but humor is always welcome? What do we think?
I think it is a little bit like that, checking in with someone, and like, do you need advice or do you want me to listen? Because the thing is, a lot of the time you don't know what you want. You don't know what you need. But it can be, if you're in pain, if you are uncertain whether you're going to live or die, actually, there's such a lack of control that it's very easy for someone to say the wrong thing. So actually, checking in, like, do you need distraction right now? Do you want to have a giggle? However you would normally talk to your friends, do you need a hug? I think is like a really nice way of bridging that gap, because no one's a mind reader and there's no way. And sometimes, even someone going, I have no idea what I need, that can be the beginning of a laugh, right? Because it's like, wow, I'm, absolutely maybe in this abyss. And sometimes it's when you're at the bottom of the abyss that laughter comes. And, one of the things about working with Shine Cancer Support is getting people together that have cancer. And I can tell you, the darkest of humor comes out of those situations. And I have seen people, when you're not even able to get the words out because you're just crying, like doubled over laughing. And they were a group of people with incurable cancer that had gotten together, and they had decided they wanted to come up with their own TV show, which anyone outside of that conversation would be horrified. But they found it so empowering to get to talk about things they couldn't talk about anywhere else. It was a cross between Pimp My Coffin and and Come Die With Me. And like how they were going to give marks for each other's funeral. And they were just, but again, if someone said, you have incurable cancer, you should be laughing, you should make jokes about it, that would be actually torturous. Do you know what I mean? It has to come from being in it, but also being around other people that understand. And that is where, it really is about connection and community that I think that rich laughter comes from.
I think what you said about community and connection is really important, because you're going to read the room is, I guess, the point that I'm making there, is that if you're with close friends and if you're with people who know you very well, then presumably they will be like, okay, I think I can say this now, and I've read the room. And if they don't, I think also what you said there is about checking in. Like, you can imagine if somebody in a situation just said, could I tell a joke right now?
Yeah.
Already that's quite funny in that situation, you know?
Yeah, and it's control.
Yeah,
You know, and it's just, and it's kind of, again, it's connection, and it's saying, you know, it's okay if you want to lead this conversation, because people with cancer want, you know, sometimes they're like, I really want to talk about it and no one's asking me, or I don't want to talk about it and no one's being normal.
Yeah.
You know, yes, tell me about that terrible date last night. Take me away from this.
Yeah.
But there's no way that someone's going to know, you know, exactly what someone needs. So yeah, that check-in and doing it in a way that is part of how you normally, you know, chat with your friend.
And we're British, and we quite like to avoid, you know, difficult conversations most of the time. So I think humour is a wonderful way of breaking through those barriers sometimes.
Yes. And as a Canadian, I've lived in the UK for many years. I so appreciate the British wit. And some of my favorite healthcare professionals were those that had a little bit of, you know, sarcasm and wit and were comfortable, because often it was directed at themselves rather than me. And I think that's really refreshing and a great use of humor. You know, if healthcare professionals, the doctors and nurses are able to kind of, you know, not be too serious with themselves and the situation, that's really helps to put you, I think, at ease. Yeah. There are degrees, aren't there, to humor? You can just have a bit of a laugh and be sarcastic, but without actually taking it into a satire or something that's really too superficial. But it's really important.
I love that you chose the word comfort just then, because I think comfort is kind of the baseline, or seeking comfort to where we find humor. I mean, we sometimes have that awkward joke to get comfortable with people, but also when we're really relaxed is when that humor just comes easily. It just flows. So I think, comfort's a really nice way of kind of thinking about is humor suitable here?
Humor makes us human as well. So to see, you know, our people that are in charge of our lives, you know, in some cases being human is really nice, at least from my perspective. Yeah.
That's a very interesting point, because we do tend to take humor away from any sort of serious situation. As soon as someone is ill, or the outside world judges it to be a serious situation, we then go, no humor for you. You must fight your battle. You must win. You must fight. And in fact, what we're hearing is that quite the opposite. It's important to have that in the journey, in the process, right from the very beginning. In fact, it's not that acceptance allows humor to come into the situation. It sounds like humor is what may allow acceptance to come into the situation. My next question then, and again, it's please feel free to join in, but it's more to Tatum and Susan again. In what ways can we as individuals be more proactive with managing our own health in respect to humor? Because, I mean, I think we all know this around the table, but I don't think everybody knows that it's quite good for you. It's actually quite healthy, bit of humor, having a laugh.
Yeah, it's a tough one, you know, how to apply humor. Again, it to health, it comes down to, I think, you know, personal perspective. But what I find really interesting too is if you look at the way we approach healthcare with children or pediatrics, we really make an effort to make it colorful, use things like animation, storytelling, make the experience, you know, really positive and light for children for good reason. But at what point do we stop becoming children, you know, when we flip it so that all of a sudden, you know, medicine becomes very serious and you know, we lose that lovely imagery and colors and you know, I think in terms of, you know, how we communicate, it's probably we've gone too far sometimes and lose that childlike attitude and approach, you know, to our health. I just don't know where the...
do you feel like it's something we should be able to request? Hi, doctor, I know I'm here for some news. Could you lighten it up, please?
Yes,
but
yes.
I see.
Yes,
I know
of course.
exactly what you're talking about, is that we do. You're right. We don't want children to worry about the severity of the situation. Yes. So we keep it positive, but we also keep it positive because we know that they'll have better outcomes if they themselves are in a more positive frame of mind. So why do we stop that with adults? In your work with Lumanity, what are some of the ways that we can actually actively bring humor back into that process?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to the way we communicate the science and the message. And that's really, really important, particularly when you're talking about healthcare professionals and patients. And science can be heavy, especially when you're, dealing with very difficult conditions. And you don't want to minimize the significance of it, but also we know that the way that science and data and medical information is communicated makes such a difference, and if you can do that in a way that the people receiving that information respond to it, then why not use an approach that, still gets the message across, but in a way that's much more accessible and people will remember. And so using nice visuals or imagery and even humor and a bit of levity sometimes can actually be much more effective in delivering that message than just hammering people with horrible statistics and medical information. So we really try to impress upon, the doctors and the medical profession in particular that, your message will be lost unless you can deliver it in a way that people respond and listen to it. And I think being a bit sometimes lighter in that approach would make a big difference.
I think there's something in analogies that's quite interesting in medical situations where using something that's lighter and a bit of levity, as you said, I think the spectrum of humour is really important here as well, in terms of, you don't want your oncologist to be straight in with dark humour. You want levity, you want lightness, but often using an analogy then, it assists in the understanding of the information that you're being given about your medical situation or prognosis, but equally you're taking it away from the medical situation. You might use a sports analogy or a food analogy or something. It's not hilarious, but it's lightening it in a way to help you understand a little bit.
I have an example. I love that. Using analogies, I think that's perfect. Very recent example, actually, just last week, my mom had a minor heart attack and had a procedure where they went in and did, it's called angioplasty. So they kind of cleaned out her arteries and veins. And after the procedure, she was in the recovery room and proceeded to have another cardiac episode, machines going off all over the place. And I wasn't there at the time, so this is secondhand information. But she was saying, she was very grateful that the cardiologist was there when this happened. And he was very reassuring. And basically, she said, well, what happens now? And he said to her, well, I'm just the plumber. What you need now is an electrician. So sending you home, you're going to see the electrician. And that's all she could talk about, since she's been home. She's well, she's in a very serious, situation, but she's telling all her friends about her plumber and her electrician. And that's how she received that information. And I think that's great if she feels that's, she's able to kind of distill it down to that nice little analogy. And she was made to feel really, I think, comfortable with that.
And the reason I mention that is because analogies always help me understand complex things, because I don't understand complex things. Mm-hmm. So I need that analogy. And when my brother was diagnosed with cancer, and he said, it's okay, it's a good one. To your point, meaning he was trying to downplay it. And I know his personality would be downplay, don't let my sister worry. So I wasn't believing him, about the treatment plan that he was going to be on and that it was going to help. And he talked about the drugs improving year on year. It was the best results, and the drugs were constantly improving. And I was like, you're fibbing to me. And then he used an analogy of light bulbs, because he's an interior designer and lighting's very important. And he talked about the evolution of the sort of incandescent light bulb to the I don't even know what they're called, the coily ones. And he said, remember when they first came out, the ones that were long-lasting light bulbs, they were hideous, horrible lights. And now you get really nice lights. And he said, in a couple of years' time, you'll forget that incandescent lights ever existed, and you'll have lots of beautiful lights. He said, that's like the drugs that I'm on. He said, it's going to be the norm. I'm going to be fine, and I got it and believed him. because he used his very important understanding about light bulbs.
I love both of those stories. I love the fact that your brother used light bulbs. As long as he's not shining it down and trying to cure COVID, he knows that that doesn't work, right? Okay, great. And the fact that your grandmother's going around telling everyone she had her pipes cleaned. So that's wonderful. So just looking at, humor and communication, and I'm looking at Anthony and Vic here. In what ways do you see humor helping with people's health? In what ways can we, I keep saying the word process, add it to the process?
Yeah, I think in a multitude of ways, but I think one of the most important things that we've talked about today are the points that both Susan and Tatum made about it being self-directed or self-expressed. So as we know in communications, the most successful communications are based on a universal human need, in an insight, as we call it. And the insight, I think, when we're talking about health and humour, is that there is a very, very thin line between sort of laughter and tragedy, like humour and hurt. And the fact that the expression laughter is the best medicine even exists, and things like a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, all these idioms and all these things that are in our language, because it's based on a fundamental human truth that people use humour to cope with health and suffering, and have done for centuries and centuries. So I think when it comes to, I'm going to talk about reading the room again, I think, but when it comes to advertising, we have to believe and truly be confident that the audience that we're speaking to are believe in this and have already come to that decision themselves. So if you were our audience, we would understand that insight is that actually, no matter how serious your situation is, you do not want lots of serious faces staring at you all the time, and you do not want masses of sympathy and empathy crushing you down. What you want is to have a laugh sometimes. And I think if we think about brands here, they have to be extremely careful of the tone that they set. So the point that you made, which I absolutely loved, and I want to see this show, Come Die With Me, was it came from sufferers. And I don't think that could have come from non-sufferers, or it couldn't come from a brand sort of selling that idea to them. So the tone has to be embracing. And I learned, I think it's affiliative humour is the name of the humour that is, it creates a community and it creates a sense of belonging. And it's often seen as quite a generic type of humour, but it is the humour that isn't going to cause harm. So I think in terms of communications, you just have to strike that right tone. And it's about reading the room, understanding your audience, understanding what's going to be relevant to them, but also their needs. And you're not going to probably go in with sarcasm or satire or anything too grim. So I think there's lots and lots of ways that through communications we can use humour in these serious situations. But the fundamental point is it has to come from an insight about the people that we're speaking to.
And that's why we, at every opportunity, try to get the patients and their families themselves directly in touch with the healthcare community. So, we will often bring doctors into conversations with patients that aren't about the patients themselves, but are more broadly around how to be better communicators, and let them hear in a different context, what patients need in terms of their communication. And inevitably, it's always the same, that patients will say, we may forget what you tell us, but we won't forget how you made us feel. And that's so important. And, it's easier to do that by being human and natural and probably funny in the right situation. But I mean, the flip side is a lot of these doctors spend a lot of time and a lot of energy, and rightly so, focusing on being very scientific and serious and making sure they understand the disease and the conditions. And it's not very funny at all, is it? So, it's hard for them, I think, to naturally shift to being, coming outside of that very scientific, doctor mode into a different sort of relationship. But it's really, really important, particularly as patients now don't need doctors all the time to get the information they need. They can go get it from the internet. They get it from their friends and families, and then they bring it to their doctors. So the doctors need to be able to contextualize that for them, and the way they deliver that message, I think, is more important than ever.
There's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there about, how stress is incredibly bad for us. It creates real ill health. And I think comedy is often the answer to that. And I see it in the festival all the time. There's a reason why there are many doctors who become comedians. There are a great many doctors who become comedians because of, I think that absolute light and shade of our lives and finding funny in some of those more difficult situations. But there is no doubt that we see it over the course of a festival. You see the mental health of people who are there for the whole time just improve in the 3 weeks. It's extraordinary how a community changes over the course of that time.
Unless you're one of the artists.
Unless you're one of the artists. And then
By the end,
it goes
you're a complete
exactly the
wreck.
opposite way. But it really fascinates me that, there are real scientific, evidential facts around the fact that humour is good for your heart. It's good for your de-stressing. It's good for the increase in endorphins. There are so many ways in which this scientifically does improve our health. So I think, again, if you're unwell, then clearly that is going to have a positive effect as well.
Yeah, so what we know is, thank you for bringing that into it actually, is because we haven't really discussed the fact that scientifically we know that humor is not just good for your health, but can actually affect your prognosis over time as patients who've been diagnosed and are going through a recovery journey. In what ways, therefore, then can patients access more humor? I'm looking at, we know that there's a strong connection between the arts and medicine and health, because again, I've been to the festival many times as well. You see that. You see how popular if a cancer recovery patient goes and does a show, how popular that it is for everybody else who goes and says, thank you for talking about this and for presenting it in such a humorous way. I went through this, or a friend or a family member went through this, and we weren't able to speak as openly about this because we didn't know we were allowed to. So what are the different ways that people can help themselves, not only to access humor, but if they themselves need it for their health journey?
How do you access humor? It's all around us, isn't it? There are many great festivals. There are comedy clubs pretty much in every city, and there are incredible podcasts. The rise of podcasts has meant that there is, you can listen to comedy all day long if you want to, and some of it is remarkably dark, and does touch on difficult subjects. But because we're so awkward in this country, it's the only way we sometimes talk about them. So actually, we naturally go to that sort of comedy place to talk about some difficult things. When my father died, my mother, we had this very difficult moment of having to have the very difficult conversation of the funeral, and didn't really want to talk to my mother about it. And she came up to, I used to be a carpenter before I became a producer. And she said to me, she put her hand on my arm and she said, darling, would you make his coffin? And in this moment of thinking, are you serious about it? But my goodness me, everyone in the room had a very good laugh at me when I really did think she really did want me to make his coffin. But actually what it meant was that we could access this whole conversation with a great deal of much more sympathy and much more sort of openness about it. But no, I didn't make his coffin, and I was never that good a carpenter. But it was amazing how we could then have this conversation, which no one really wanted to kind of talk about. But it was just a wonderful moment.
I feel like that was a massive oversight in your carpentry education. Yeah. Surely is that not
in answer to your question, I agree with everything that you said there, but I would also say it's a lot easier now because of, TikTok. And I don't know if anybody, we're all too young, has access to menopause talk. There's just so many things on Instagram and on TikTok that deal with health issues in a very humorous way and make it feel like, I hate this expression, but make you feel seen. So you're suffering, you feel like an absolute bag of shit, I'm sorry for swearing, because you're going through the menopause, but you think, I need to to your point, struggle on, like a good old Brit, then you see these humorous takes. A lot of people say, and I'm like, that's me, I'm feeling like that. And now I feel like it's okay, and I'm crying with laughter rather than crying with frustration, thinking I'm alone in this. So that's that's my experience in terms of accessing humour to do with health, I guess. But lots of other communities on there that are just bringing the levity to the seriousness, and so easy to access, I think, as well.
And being in a room full of other people. That idea of gathering, I mean, we live our lives digitally so much now. That idea of gathering in a place and being part of a community, being part of a room full of people who are engaging in common is, I think, incredibly uplifting and healthy and good for you.
Well, laughter is famously contagious, isn't it? It's why we want our comedy audiences to be packed so closely together, because we know if our audience sits as closely as possible, that if one person is laughing at something, everyone else will pick that up. You don't actually want to spread people out across a room when they're there to laugh, because they won't actually derive maximum benefit from it. So just to sort of summarize, and please do come in if I've forgotten anything, what I'm hearing is that A, humor is important from the very beginning, and it can help towards acceptance, rather than acceptance being the permission to use humor. I'm hearing that there's a lot of learning to be done on both sides both sides, I say both sides, actually there's three sides to it, isn't there? There's the patient who's going through, living the experience. There's their community around them that needs to take their lead from the patient in terms of understanding when it is okay to use levity, and actually literally just checking in, literally go, want some jokes right now? Is actually a positive thing to ask rather than an insensitive thing to ask. And then you've got the third side to that, which is all of the health professionals that are working in the industry that need to be aware that while humor is a great thing, sometimes if you use too much levity, it might be taken the wrong way. So you need to make sure that your message is still getting across, even if you're packaging it in a nicer wrapping. But then we move from that to the communications industry, where it's important to know, as you were saying, I thought it was interesting you were saying you need to know your audience, because what I'm hearing from our conversation is that you actually need to understand that it starts from the patient, it starts from the sufferer and goes from there. So if you're working in communications, you need to obviously understand the audience that's watching, but that in and amongst the audience will be the actual people who have perhaps the most right to start the humor from that. And that generally, humor is good for us. It's good for us, except for comedians. Just remember that. Comedians actually live, on average, 7 years less than everybody else. So we're giving ourselves over to the cause. Thanks again for joining me on A Healthy Dose of Humor. And remember, if you're interested in hearing more about the topic of health and humor, or connecting with any of our series contributors, you can access all of that and more at leith.co.uk/healthydose.